Okay, the next video comes from AgPhD. Let's take a look and see what AgPhD has to say.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk a little about soils. In particular, soil pH and how that affects nutrient availability for crops.
Okay, so for those of you who may not know, this is Brian and Darren Hefty. Brian and Darren are evidence deniers. They are base saturation enthusiasts. They are immensely influential in South Dakota. They put on a field day that rivals any university field day. I mean, they have huge sponsors, Bayer, BASF, FMC. They are no small players in the nutrient soil business at all. Don't take these guys lightly. They have a radio show. I believe their radio show may even be on Sirius XM. They are huge. They put on a conference. They have winter conferences. They have just a tremendous footprint and platform in soils. They're almost always in ag. They rarely kind of venture over into home lawns, but occasionally they do, which is one reason why I'm showing this video tonight. We're talking about pH, and they're going to talk about pH right now. And I'm going to let them kind of make their claim and then explain to you using the evidence how this sort of propaganda is so immensely important to identify and squash. They have a tremendous impact in our industry. They have big money, hundreds of thousands of dollars they pull in on their field day. It's enormous. And, they're no small players. So let's look and see what the rest of this video has to say about pH.
What's fun this spring and early summer is getting soil tests from across the country and in different situations. Now, for example, one of the things that we saw was low micronutrient availability, and one of them in particular was manganese. Whenever we would see a 7 pH or higher especially, or even some of the upper 6s, we saw lower levels of manganese on many of the tests.
Yeah, and so this is very common. Okay, this happens. I'll notice this as well. Okay, it's just an observation. It's solely anecdotal. Okay, there can be cases where manganese is low at low pH. There can be cases where manganese is high at low pH. Okay, there's more going on in the soil than just pH is low, therefore manganese is more soluble. pH is high, that way, therefore manganese is less soluble. There's a tremendous amount of dynamics and interactions going on in the soil. And just because the pH is low on this soil test and you see it correlate with a high manganese concentration does not necessarily mean that you should maintain this lower pH. And I'm going to explain why, and hopefully the authors of the paper tonight are going to explain why that is. Okay, let's get back to the video.
And when we saw lower soil pHs like low 6s, upper 5s, we saw higher availability of manganese.
So again, availability is usually it's a phrase, at least for me anyway. It's a phrase that I'll catch in language that it's not. Sometimes it's just misspoken. Like sometimes I'll just misspeak and use that word. Maybe he just misspoke and used that word. I don't know. But we just generally as soil scientists don't say available, plant available. I don't even know what that, I mean, it's just not a soil chemistry word really, or phrase. It's it's soluble or it's insoluble, it's exchangeable or it's non-exchangeable, or it's an organic element or bound with organic ligands or whatever the case might be. But to say it's plant available takes a tremendous leap of faith to be able to say that. And so when you hear these words, I was like, there's just little bitty points that I'm hitting in my mind going, if I didn't know Darren, or I don't know either one of them, but I've seen some of the videos. If I didn't know Darren or Brian, I would be thinking, oh, wait a second. He may not know what he thinks he knows here, but nevertheless, let's just continue.
Do you see a correlation here with soil pH and potential nutrient tie-up?
All right.
So soil pH and potential nutrient tie-up. The BS, you're going to have to hike your boots up here in a little bit. Okay, the BS starts to flow. I'll just say that.
And I want to give you a very specific example with one of the primary nutrients, phosphorus.
Okay, so here comes the BS. I don't know these guys' backgrounds. They may be the world's greatest soil scientists and phosphorus bioavailability experts. I have no clue. But when the next couple of sentences, when he says this, think to yourself. When he says these things, I'm gonna stop it. And I'm gonna go back to a article. Think to yourself, did I also think that way, or that what he said probably it sounded correct to me? Think if that's what you think, you're in the boat with a lot of people. Very common. Okay, here we go.
What happens with phosphorus is it's usually in the phosphate form, and in high pH soils, there's typically excess calcium. Well, calcium can bind with phosphate to form calcium phosphate, which unfortunately is insoluble in water. When it doesn't dissolve in water, that means the plant can't bring it in. It's not in a form the plant can use. So it's all because the soil pH gets so high, and then we start seeing that excess in calcium and the binding with phosphate. Now, the same thing can happen with phosphorus when we get to the low pHs. So that calcium thing happens predominantly in the 7.5 to 8.5 range for pH. When the pH is low, let's say it's down in the 5s, we'll commonly see phosphate binding with iron.
Okay, so this is what's referred to as the double sink. Okay, there's very little evidence to support this idea that phosphorus will bind with calcium at high pH and iron and aluminum will bind with phosphorus at low pH, and therefore there's a sink at both ends of the pH spectrum. I'm going to go over that tonight, okay? But if you heard what he said, he's basically saying that, well, he's not saying, I mean, he's not basically saying, he's saying that you need to keep phosphorus, you need to keep the pH, in this neutral to slightly acidic range for maximum phosphorus availability, because there's a sink for phosphorus at the high end due to calcium. There's a sink for phosphorus at the low end due to aluminum and iron. And if you also have heard that, or you're in the position where you believe that or whatever, you're in the same boat with a lot of people. Okay, well, we're going to explain tonight. I'm going to explain here in a couple of minutes on this next PDF why that just doesn't hold water in the world of soil chemistry.
When the pH is down in the 4s, we commonly see phosphate binding with aluminum. Well, in either case, there's phosphorus in the soil, but unfortunately it's binding with another nutrient, so the plants can't get it and use it. That's a real problem. By simply getting the soil pH in the appropriate range, let's say around 6, 6.5, 7, somewhere in that range, phosphorus becomes a lot more available than it is when the pH is too low or too high.
Yeah, see, this is just simply not true. I don't know who these guys are, Brian, and Darren. I don't know their background, but they just don't know soil science when it comes to phosphate availability or solubility. They just don't understand it. So, and I'm not claiming I do. But we're going to go over two articles tonight. We're going to briefly go over one little article. It's going to take just a minute or two. And then we're going over the big article. And they're going to show where phosphorus availability is not maximized at this 6 to 7 range. Okay? We're going to get there. Let's continue.
Now, if your pH is too low, one of the easiest ways to raise that pH up is by applying calcium carbonate. This is something that could be used in your lawn. It could be used in fields, certainly could be used in gardens as well. One spot in particular I'll point out for your lawn is if you have a dog and that dog does his thing out in your yard and you have little spots in your yard that are dying. The cure for that is lime. It's calcium carbonate.
Now, I don't know if I'm sure there's research on turfgrass dying from dog urine. I'm sure there's research somewhere. But I'll admit a little bit of ignorance there. I don't know all the chemistry behind that. I always assumed that it was dead because of the salt content of the urine, not because it's influencing the soil pH. And what he's saying is you should apply lime. Let's see this again.
Raising the pH up can fix that problem. Does his thing out in your yard and you have little spots in your yard that are dying. The cure for that is lime. It's calcium carbonate. Raising the pH up can fix that problem.
Now, maybe someone can post something. I don't know. I've never heard that. Raising the pH of your soil can fix dog urine stains or death of your turf by dog urine. I've never heard that. I don't know if it's true or not true. I just always it's always been explained to me that the death of the turf was a result of the burn of the urea, the salt content of the dog urine itself. But I could be wrong. So, but he included that in turf, so it's fair game for me to show. That's the reason I'm showing this video. Let's continue.
Because what the dog left behind was very acidic. So acid is the key if you wanted to lower a high pH. In fields, we usually talk about improving drainage to flush salts out. Generally speaking, when we have more salts and more sodium, that pH starts to climb. That can be a real problem.
Of course, improving that drainage is important. And then one thing that you could apply in high pH situations in many cases is elemental sulfur. That can help form sulfuric acid in your soil and lower that pH back down.
Well, once again, the pH of the soil has an enormous impact on availability of nutrients. I gave you the example of phosphate in low pH, high pH, and neutral pH, but the same types of things can happen with just about any nutrient out there. So as farmers, and for that matter, if you have a garden or a lawn, whatever, you want to try to get that soil pH around that 6 to 7 range for most crops, most lawns, most situations. But I will say there are certain crops, they prefer a little bit lower pH, others like a little higher pH, and that's one of the things we commonly talk with farmers about.
Okay, so he qualified himself at there at the end. Most soils, most crops, most this, it's 6 to 7 for most and most. So you qualify yourself there. This is just a general phrase that has been so driven into our minds that I doubt there's many people listening to this show tonight or on podcasts that disagree with that statement. I doubt there's many that would disagree with that statement, except me and the authors of the article that I'm going to show tonight. I'm going to explain why moving pH could end up screwing stuff up. Okay, let's look at the article. What his claim was at the what was it? The middle of it was that high pH phosphorus will bind with calcium. Low pH phosphorus will bind with aluminum and iron. And so the maximum availability is somewhere in the middle. So if we go to this article, I'm not going to go over this article right now. I'm going to go over this article in another maybe even next or 2 weeks from now, on a Wednesday night. I'm not going to go over this whole article right now. The effects of pH on phosphate uptake from the soil. This is by an author named N.J. Barrow, who's in Australia, been there for ages and ages and ages. And what he's talking about, the Darren or Brian, whoever said that, he's talking about this graph where we see phosphorus being bound with calcium. When you get up to 7s, 8s, and 9s and above, you see this binding amount of phosphate fixation being highest at these high pHs from calcium. And you see once you get below 7, you see aluminum and you see iron binding phosphorus at the lower pHs. So he's talking about this figure right here. Okay, there's been many reproductions of a figure very similar to this. It could be slightly adjusted here or there, but that's the basic idea, is that fixation of phosphorus by calcium at high pHs and iron, aluminum at low pHs is maximized at these low and high pHs. And in the middle, right here, it says range of highest phosphorus availability right here. Okay, that's what they're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go through this whole article at some point in the future, but not tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to read the conclusions, and I'm going to go back to I think there's 2 figures. Yeah, right there. That I'm going to go over. But here's the conclusion. The very last paragraph of this paper says the following: soil pH affects the availability of many nutrients and of several toxic elements. And that's what I want to make sure it's clear tonight. I'm not saying it doesn't affect the solubility of it, and neither are they. We're not saying that at all. It does affect the availability of nutrients. pH does do that. Okay, I'm not saying it doesn't. The optimum pH for plant growth depends on which of these elements is most limiting. So if phosphorus is not the most limiting nutrient and you try to adjust the pH down, up or down to make phosphorus more available, but it's not the most limiting nutrient, you could be altering the availability of the element that is most limiting. Okay, we're going to go over that. This was shown in figure 10b, well, I'm going to go over that in a minute, in which clovers were limited by phosphorus supply, but the grass was limited by the nitrogen supply. Consequently, the optimum pH differed. This illustrates the kind of evaluation needed in many practical situations when deciding what pH to aim for. Raising the pH to, say, 6 to 7, which is what he just said, I'll say 6 to 7, somewhere in like that. Raising the pH to say 6 to 7 might be justified for several reasons, but increasing the availability of phosphate is not one of them. That is one of the most profound sentences I've probably read on this channel. Let me read it again. Raising the pH to say 6 to 7 might be justified for several reasons, which I agree, might be justified. But increasing the availability of phosphorus is not one of them. Let's go up here and look at these two figures. In this figure, for those listening, we're looking at two different panels of the same figure. Both panels have the x-axis going from pH 4 to 8. And on the x-axis is 4 to 8. The y-axis is yield of tops, grams per pot. And one of the panels, we're looking at two species of clover and then one species of lolium species. And I forget this species on this one here. This was trifolium. Okay, so this was also a clover, I believe. So this is all clover, and then this is clover and lolium. In this figure, we see pH go from 8 to, well, let's say 7, okay? And the scientist is applying either no phosphorus, 50 milligrams per kilogram, or 100 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus to clover that is not deficient in nitrogen. It's a legume. Okay, it's not going to be deficient in nitrogen. When we see the pH decline from 7 to 4, we see the yield peak, not really do much. It kind of goes up from 7 to 6 on this no phosphorus applied, but we see it peak from about 5.5 to 5, and it peaks here at 5 when no phosphorus was applied. When you apply phosphorus, it goes the yield also peaks. It goes up from 7 to 6 as well, but it peaks at around 5. And when you apply 50 grams per kilogram, when you double that, it also peaks at around 5. The yield of clover that is not nitrogen deficient peaks at a pH of 5 because it was phosphorus deficient, meaning or indicating that the greatest uptake of phosphorus did not occur between 6 and 7. It occurred at 5, much lower. Okay, now let's look at the next panel over here, panel B. We see 2 clover species, and we see 1 lolium species. This species here is not a legume. It has to be fed nitrogen, basically, in order to be, well, in this case, it's probably yield. But as the pH goes up, we see the yield of this lolium species continue to go up, clear up to 7, whereas the yield of the clover goes down from 5. There's never a point where it just continues to go down and down and down from 5 to 6, from 6 to 7, the yield of this non-limiting nitrogen species, the clover. So why did this species go up and this species go down? The yield go down on the clover, but the yield went up on the lolium. In this case, when the pH is going up from this lolium species, there's more organic material being mineralized as the pH goes up from 5 to 6 to 7. There's more nitrogen being mineralized, which I'm going to show you in the very next article. Okay, so as we move the pH up, more nitrogen is going to become more available between 5 and 7, because assuming you have some appreciable amounts of organic material, because the organic material is going to be mineralizing nitrogen and it's going to become available. But with the clover, it didn't matter because it wasn't nitrogen deficient. Okay, so the maximum uptake yield as a result of phosphorus occurred at a pH below 6. Okay, that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that these two, Brian and Darren, the two evidence deniers who spew unbelievable amounts of nonsense when it comes to base saturation and calcium, and just, I mean, it's insane, and they have a tremendous impact. They are not two guys sitting in their, closet, not, just fiddle-faddling around. They have a tremendous impact and influence. They are highly influential, and they're spewing all kinds of nonsense. And they're saying that because calcium is binding in phosphorus on the high end, and because aluminum ion is binding phosphorus on the low end, you should keep the pH between 6 to 7, specifically for phosphorus uptake. And the evidence I just showed you clearly indicates that that's not true.